This is the smell of the leftover tuna fish sandwich you left in your lunchbox over the weekend in a wimpy trash bag.
Wimpy, wimpy, wimpy!
Blech! And this is the smell of that same sandwich in a Hefty Ultra Strong trash bag.
Hefty, hefty, hefty!
Ah, smell the difference? Hefty Ultra Strong has Arm & Hammer with continuous odor control, so no matter what's inside your trash, you can stay one step ahead of stinky. And for bigger jobs, try the superior strength of Hefty Large Black Bags.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going back to the founding of the United States. Well, actually, when the United States declared independence from Great Britain in July of 1776, and we're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, Ray, I think we all know the powerful words that are embodied in this document. But one of the things I think that we fail to remember or understand is that this document was very difficult in being put together. And it was fraught with controversy from the very beginning. And we celebrate independence and we enjoy the fireworks and the flag and hot dogs and parades. But Ray, when the individuals were meeting to discuss the Declaration of Independence, a lot of people were fearful of putting their name to a document that would go against Mother Britain because they thought not only could it hurt what they had been trying to establish, but could also cost them their lives.
Yeah, and you know, the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress that was meeting there in Philadelphia, when all this really starts is early June 1776 with a resolution that these united colonies are and a right ought to be free and independent states. So you have this resolution that's put on the table, and then it's sort of tabled because they want to come up with an explanation for what they're doing. Why are we getting ready to declare independence? Why are we getting ready to do this? And they put together a committee, and on this committee, there was 5 people on the committee. On the committee, though, people our audience are going to know: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. And they are actually going to meet to decide, all right, how are we going to put together this Declaration of Independence and who's going to write it? And Chris, as you know, Thomas Jefferson ended up pulling a lot of the weight of writing this document.
Yeah, he just about pulled all of the weight. And I think that the big reason, and I think we need to go back, that it is interesting how history looks today than what it was, because the person who actually got the ball rolling is probably somebody nobody even knows, Richard Henry Lee.
Yep.
So it's his momentous decision to stand up in that body and say, I want to make a motion for independence, that allows Thomas Jefferson and that committee of 5 to actually do their work. And from what I've read in history, and tell me if I'm wrong, but what I've read in history is that Richard Henry Lee wanted to be part of that committee. He wanted his name on that document of writing the Declaration of Independence. But then a couple of things happened. Number one, they thought, well, you would be better used in writing articles about a government and how a government could form a little bit later. But then the other thing that happens is his wife gets really, really sick. And so he actually leaves the Continental Congress and heads back home to take care of his ailing wife. And, you know, if you just think back to that moment, he chose his family over this life-changing, defining moment. And he is a true founding father, and he is a remarkable individual. And unfortunately, history has kind of put him at the end of the book because we all focus on Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, and there's a lot. I mean, if you look at the Declaration of Independence and every signature on there, from John Hancock to Thomas Jefferson to John Adams, Samuel Adams, all of them, they're all founders of the United States.
And isn't it interesting how each of them have character and how they have some really unique character? You mentioned the Committee of 5, and I think it's interesting. I always like to kind of be in the room, right, and just think about how this happened. I mentioned those 5 guys got together. and somebody probably looked around and said, all right, so where do we begin? And I just imagine that old Benjamin Franklin, who's the oldest member of the team, right, of the whole Continental Congress, he's there and he's like, dude, I'm just here. I really have no interest in this. I'll offer you some insight, but I'll be down at the tavern. If you need anything, you just go on. And so then they look at John Adams, and I think that John Adams was probably the one that in the room that was saying you should do it. And for the first time, John Adams actually looks at Thomas Jefferson and says, I do not need to be the one to write this. People think that I'm stubborn. They think that I'm cranky. I'm just not a very inviting person in people's minds. And so it's not going to be me. And poor Jefferson, who's the youngest of the group, the silent one in the group, right? But he's a powerful writer. And so they look to him and say, yeah, you drew the final straw. You get to do it. But he's the one that lasts in history as being the one who wrote this document.
Yeah, and Jefferson, there was a reason they pointed to him. He was a Southerner. He was from Virginia, which would have been very important. But also, he was known for writing, very good writing and writing important documents. So this was something that he had done before to some degree. And it was something that they had read that he had done. They'd read the works he had done, and they were very impressed. And when you look at the Declaration of Independence, you can see why they went to him. Now he's going to write from June 11, I believe, to June 28. It's going to take the better part of a month, a good chunk of a month, for him to put this document together. Now, Chris, I think where we wanted to go with this conversation today was the original version he wrote and sort of comparing it to some degree to what we have today and what we're familiar with. Because, there are some real differences and reasons behind those differences between the original draft Jefferson wrote and what ended up being published and what people are familiar with it today. Because it is important for our listeners to know that once Jefferson wrote it, it had to go this committee, included Franklin and Adams. They had to make their little adjustments to it. Then it was going to go to the entire Congress for them to make their adjustments to it. So by the time you sort of get to the end of the road, this thing has been edited and updated several times. And the changes we're going to look at, some of the changes we're going to look at today anyway, are a product of that process.
Yeah, I mean, just as we get into that preamble of the Declaration of Independence, and just talking about, listen, there is a moment in time in which it's just necessary. You can try all that you can to try to resolve, to try to bring together, but there comes a moment when you have done all that is needed and you have to leave. And in that original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's very insistent on saying this is not just a Declaration of Independence in which we're just telling you we're out of here, but rather he finds that it's important to demonstrate why they have to make this change. And I've always, we know the phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what I find to be interesting is that in that rough draft, Ray, he starts that section off by saying we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And that all men are created equal, but also independent. And I just go back to this document, and all of us know all men are created equal. But Ray, in the midst of writing this document, it is very clear that not all individuals, not all persons are equal in this moment, because within the very colonies that are wanting to declare independence, we have plantation owners, we have artisans, we have indentured servants, and we have the enslaved. And I really believe, because as you mentioned, that Jefferson, a very careful writer, a very conscious writer, that he had to have some wrestling with the words that he chose. That, Ray, one of the things that he says is that we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And I just find that to be so powerful, maybe even more so than we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Yeah, I've sort of often wondered where that change came from. Apparently, the change from sacred to undeniable, sacred and undeniable to self-evident. A lot of it's unclear, as far as my understanding. It's really unclear how that change came about. But there is some reason to believe maybe Benjamin Franklin was behind that change. That's an interesting change, because you go from sacred and undeniable, which, at least the word sacred has a almost religious undertone to it, and you go to self-evident, which is it's sort of obvious. So you have this very dramatic shift toward less maybe religious language. Whether Franklin was behind it, or Jefferson was behind it, or Adams was behind it, you have this interesting shift there.
But we also have to recognize who the Declaration of Independence was being written for, and that it's not just being written for the colonies, but also France, Spain, and even the members in England. That and that's why I think another interesting differentiation between the original draft and then the one that was actually published is that Jefferson in both of those is giving reasons for he has, but there's a few points in the original draft in which it also calls out just everybody in England. It's not just like this is between the colonies and King George, but this is between the colonies and England. And I think that you needed that softer approach because the colonies needed to be friends with as many people as they could be friends with. And I think if you would be so hard on England, that's going to have a sour taste in their mouths instead of just being hard on the king.
Yeah, they wanted to focus on King George III, and to some degree, I suppose, Parliament. But it's much easier to, I guess you could say, make a person an enemy than to make a group of persons an enemy. It's much easier to have that one sort of fall guy than however many people were in Parliament at the time. In fact, on July 2, in Thomas Jefferson's notes from the proceedings in the Continental Congress, he writes, and I'm quoting him here, "We had friends in England worth keeping terms with, still haunted the minds of many. For this reason, those passages which conveyed censures on the people of England were struck out," end quote. So in other words, they looked at what Jefferson had written and they said, don't know about that. That might offend the wrong people. We need the people of England on our side. And remember, during the war, there were those in England and even in Parliament, we call them Whigs, who did at the very least sympathize with the American cause. And the last thing you wanted to do is slap those people in the face and cause them to turn against you.
Yeah. And, in thinking about turning people against you, but also it's not just turning people against you, but we're also finding out that this document has to unite people. And as you mentioned, the very first people that Jefferson has got to write to are the members of that Continental Congress. For this to even become reality, he's got to convince them before he convinces anybody else that this is the only path, that this is the right path. And so as he's crafting that document, he has some personal feelings about some things, and he puts those feelings in there. And then next thing you know, they get omitted, right? And they get lost from history, except for us bringing it out today and other historians and people writing about it. Because, Ray, there is something that is in the original first draft in which Jefferson describes an event, an activity that he basically says is a crime against humanity, blaming the king on it. But it never makes its way into the official Declaration of Independence. And we have to ask ourselves, what was it?
Yeah.
And why did it get left out?
And you sort of hinted at it earlier in the opening 2 paragraphs or so of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with their Creator by certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you mentioned the fact that there was an entire, population of people, well, actually more than one population of people in the United States at the time, or in the United Colonies at the time, that, this did not apply to. First off, it said all men are created equal. We know that women did not have what we would call equal rights back then. We talk about Native Americans, but the group that I think you're focusing in on is African slaves. And Jefferson does, in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he nails King George III. He nails the responsibility of slavery on King George III when he says this. I'm quoting the document here, quote, "He," that is King George III, "has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery into another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transition thither," unquote. This, Chris, and I think we have to sort of, when we read that, we have to sort of remember slavery was going on in the colonies prior to George III. So he's pinning something here on George III that George III, did not start. But also, Chris, the man pinning this, according to Monticello itself, had around 130 African slaves at Monticello at any given point in his life, and over the period of his life held about 600 slaves. And unlike George Washington, who freed a group of his slaves upon his death, or his idea was going to be upon Martha's death, but they were actually freed soon after Washington died. Jefferson didn't do that. This is a man who had a large number of slaves, yet here he is trying to peg slavery on King George III.
Yeah, and I wish I could be there, or I wish I could just have dinner with these guys and ask the questions, because this is a very painful and difficult omission, because this entire embodiment of work is basically saying we are tired of being oppressed by King George. We as white colony people, we're tired of taxation without representation. We're tired of being punished. We're tired of being, all of these things that you just mentioned, but yet some of these are doing the exact same thing. And so it is a very hypocritical document, just to be honest, especially when you take 168 words, which is what Jefferson devotes right there to the slavery and to King George. And so, I think that there is this, I don't want to sound, I cannot be a defender of this with Jefferson, because I really don't know, because of, as you said, he said one thing and did another. But Ray, this was a very difficult period in American history. And Jefferson, who says he hates slavery, abhors it, but yet is doing it, what convinces someone that you're going to be able to say it and nobody's going to look at you and say, how can you say that and then act the opposite? How do you get a nation to support independence if you write that you're against slavery but still allow it?
And that was one of the criticisms that was often raised, or ideas that was often raised, when the push for independence was on. How can we, on one hand, declare we're not going to be slaves to Great Britain, and that kind of language was used, while on the other hand, we are holding slaves ourselves? How can the two things both be true? So there was, I think you're right, there was a little hypocrisy here, in that on one hand, they want freedom for themselves, but they're not willing to give freedom to other people, to other people. And Jefferson here, of course, again, is wanting to push the responsibility of this onto the king.
He's wanting to push the responsibility on the king, but do you think it's possible that Jefferson was looking for a way out by putting this into the Declaration of Independence? So, he's saying, listen, if I've got a document that is signed by 13 colonies that says that slavery is wrong, I've got an out to try to get out of this whole slavery business? Or do you think he put it in there hoping that he was going to look good, but knowing it was going to fail, because there's no way that South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, or Virginia is going to accept a document like this. And so he can come back later on and say, hey, I was against it. I said I was against it, but it is what it is. And so in order for me to survive, I kind of got to stick with it.
Yeah, those are interesting thoughts. I don't know the answer as to what he was up to here. Did he think somehow this was a loophole that he could, maybe run through, or was he up to something else? I don't know. It is a very interesting thought. In here, he does something in this section. I think you said it was 168 words. In this section, he does something that I found very interesting. Not only does he, like we said, lay the responsibility of slavery at the feet of George III, he also goes in and he sort of, gets personal with the king, if this wasn't already personal. I mean, and he says, this piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the, all caps, Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished die. In other words, he goes right to the thing, and he says this is a quote unquote Christian king who is selling people and who's trying to keep this thing going. I mean, that was awfully personal shot at George III, who, if memory serves me correct, did not have slaves. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I don't think he did.
No, and that was the whole thing. Now, but Jefferson is saying, and I think, you see a lot of casting the blame here, because if he can convince an entire world, because remember, he is trying to convince the entire world. If he can convince the entire world that the only reason that the colonies have slavery is because of King George, then it's kind of like, hey, this is not something we wanted, but in order, because of the triangle trade, right? So, the colonies are shipping over the lumber and the things like that to England. England's making the goods and then selling it to Africa. And Africa is like, I don't have the money, so I'll just sell it to slaves. And then England sending the slaves down to not just the colonies, but also Bermuda and Haiti and to even South America, where they're doing the sugar cane and all the other things.
Yeah, and in fact, during the height of the slave trade, the vast majority of slaves crossing the Atlantic Ocean from the west coast of Africa, the so-called slave coast, coming to the Americas, did not come into what is today the United States. The vast majority of them were headed to the Caribbean or to South America and that kind of thing. But what became so devastating about slavery in what would become the United States was that it didn't really need to depend on that slave trade, because it developed something of an internal reproduction. That is, slaves who got together and had children, and those children, of course, as you know, most of the slave laws said that the condition of the child was based on the condition of the mother. So if the mother was a slave, her children was enslaved, regardless of who the father was. So it had the ability to just sort of keep reproducing itself. So it didn't need the international slave trade so much. And that's why in the Constitution, I think it's the year 1808, the United States would pull out of that particular trade in 1808, because it didn't need it.
Yeah, and I do think there's something else here also, and you and I, we do in our classes, our courses that we teach, we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. We don't run from things. We have to address this, because there was an original draft that condemned slavery, and it did not make it into the draft that we know of today. So this moral mission statement of America, of the colonies, that says all men are created equal and that they are not to be deprived of their God-given divine rights. But they did lose their rights. And as historians, we can say, okay, so we know it's wrong. We know it's terrible, and it is gravely an injustice. But why did they do this? And so I do think that, as you've mentioned and we've talked about, the southern states were against it. The southern states were just against any condemnation of slavery, because if you take the slaves out of their business, they don't have a business. There's no more tobacco, there's no more cotton, there's no more sugar cane for the rum, things of that nature, right? So the southern states are just going to be completely against it. The other thing that happens is you are right now declaring independence from a mighty nation, a mighty, mighty country that has a powerful army, that has a king. It has basically been controlling a lot of things for many times. And this is where I want your expertise with George Washington, because George Washington is a power player, and with everything going on during this time, right? And so George actually says something about this, even in regards to slavery, because we have to acknowledge he had slaves also. But the question comes, and we're not justifying. I want to make sure our listeners understand. I am not justifying what they had to decide. I'm just talking about it. But if I'm not mistaken, Washington and Jefferson, all of these guys were basically saying, listen, it's either do away with slavery and possibly lose the country, or try to start a country. And then, as you mentioned, in 1808, we'll come back and try to deal with this travesty of a thing. But we cannot do both. So we've got to choose. And for the sake of country, we're going to put slavery aside. Not justifying that, but that is my interpretation of kind of where they found themselves and what they had to do. And I'd be interested, because you are an expert with Washington. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, they, in debates that occurred in the early Congress, if Benjamin Franklin toward the end of his life had written a petition calling for the end of slavery, and it goes to Congress, and I mean, this is just, it about rips the place apart. It was sort of Georgia and South Carolina and some degree North Carolina. We just would not even tolerate it. The very idea that you would touch slavery, that was the third rail of politics at this point. And even here with the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson actually calls out Carolina and Georgia in that on his notes on the proceedings of the Continental Congress. He says that this particular section on slavery in the Declaration of Independence, he says, quote, was struck out in compliance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it, end quote. So he later on it's South Carolina, it's Georgia. Here, all the way back to the Continental Congress, when they're when they're debating the Declaration of Independence, it's South Carolina and Georgia. But lest we think that the northern colonies just got off the hook, he doesn't go there. He says, quote, our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under those censures, for though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they have been pretty considerable carriers of them to others, end quote. In other words, the northern states, they may not have a lot in the way of slaves necessarily, but they're just as much a part of that as what's going on in the South. I mean, you think about it, Chris, especially when you think about cotton and the Cotton Kingdom in the 19th century, who was buying a lot of that cotton coming out of the South? It was the industrial North. So both the North and the South have built a economic empire on the backs of these slaves, and neither side can really get out from under that.
And according to Jefferson, he wants all the blame to go towards King George.
Yeah,
to kind of keep this all going.
He tries to blame King George in the Declaration, his original draft of the Declaration. But not only does he do that, he sort of tries to, I guess, stir a little fear, because in 1775, Lord Dunmore, this British official, had issued a proclamation. Basically, if slaves could get free, they could come join the army and the British army and be free. And Jefferson says here, quote, he, speaking of King George III, is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, end quote. Think about this. What Jefferson is basically saying is, what is the number one fear of a slaveholder? the number one fear of that slaveholder was that those slaves would rise up against him, would rise up against his family, rise up against his neighbors. And Jefferson is using that fear and saying, look at what the British are doing. Look at what Lord Dunmore did. But notice how he puts it right smack on the head of King George III. He says, he is now exciting those very people. And it says, he has deprived them of their freedom, of their liberty. No, he didn't. Jefferson, who had slaves at at Monticello, he was depriving them of their freedom, but they're putting it all back on King George III and creating this sort of fear, or trying to create a fear among people that, these slaves, what King George III is trying to do? He's trying to encourage them to rise up against you, trying to encourage them to kill you, type of thing. So he's pulling out all the stops here, Chris.
Yeah, and the red herring fallacy, trying to get you to divert your attention to one thing, right? So, yes, we have slaves, but you have to understand why we have slaves. I mean, trying to justify. And Ray, I think here once again is the problem of the proverbial kick the can down the street. That, as they say, we'll deal with this later on. We just can't deal with it right now. Ray, this is in 1776.
Mm-hmm.
In 1865, 64, we're still dealing with this. In the 1950s and the 1960s, we're still kicking the can down the road to the point where you have a boiling point where it just erupts. And I think that the more that we continue to kick issues down the road and just say, let somebody else deal with it. I mean, because honestly, Jefferson and especially Franklin, he was like, look, 1808, I'm not going to see 1808. That'll be on somebody else. I'll be out of here. Jefferson not knowing what's ahead of him in his future. These other guys just thinking we'll deal with that later on. But Ray, there's a lesson for all of us that if you just try to kick things down the road, it's going to become more and more of an issue, and it will continue to threaten to divide the country. And I hate to say it, but if you look at things that we've kicked down the road when it comes to society today, some of that is starting to rear back up now. And it's creating such an environment that you can't have dialogue about it. You can't have conversations about it. And I think it's just because everybody says, let somebody else deal with it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Civil War. Think about this, 1860s, how many men, both Northern and Southern, died directly or indirectly, however someone wants to view it. I'm not getting into that, because the framers and the founders could not sit down at a table and negotiate this issue and really deal with it once for all. Instead, they pushed it down the road. And if you look at American political history, all the way through to the Civil War, what is most of it circulating around? Yes, you got issues with Great Britain and the War of 1812. You got issues with the election of 1824. But when you start talking about westward expansion and all of that, what's the issue that comes back to the table over and over and over again? It's the one that the framers and founders could not deal with. That's the issue of slavery. And then the 1860s is literally going to rip the country apart.
Yeah. And, I think it just speaks a lot as to what's going to happen, because we get independence. There's great celebrations. I believe that when the Declaration was read in New York City, I believe that there was a riot that occurred, right? There was so much excitement over all that was happening. However, you gained independence, but you gained a whole sort of problems because of that phrase, all men are created equal. You had a group of people who were listening. I mean, imagine, Ray. Imagine you're an enslaved and somebody is out there at the plantation reading the Declaration of Independence. Imagine you're a woman that's listening to someone read this document and people are hooting and hollering and cheering. And it comes to that phrase that all men are created equal and that they are not to be denied their divine right. And you have to imagine, what were they thinking when they heard those words and they heard the celebrations and they saw the fireworks and the parade? And they were thinking, I think it would be interesting for our listeners to go back to a podcast we did not too long ago when we were talking about Frederick Douglass, and we were talking what to the slave is the fourth. And I think that podcast can help our listeners maybe kind of understand a little bit more about what they were feeling and what they were experiencing when those words were being issued, and they were thinking, but that's not me.
Yeah, and the rhetoric coming out of the American Revolution, the rhetoric coming out of this declaration, certainly, no doubt, influenced slaves to run away, to try to seek their freedom, which in my opinion is a good thing. It was a very good thing. Unfortunately, it didn't make any changes at that time. Chris, I think this was a wonderful episode. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. I hope it drives them back to something that I know Chris and I both talk about to our students, and that is primary sources. Going back and looking at these documents, and with Google, everything, you can find almost anything you need. Gone are the days where you have to get in a car and drive to some university or some museum somewhere and don the little white gloves and handle these documents and having to be careful and making appointments, all that. Now you can just go on Google and you can just search, and there's plenty of material out there, documents out there. Yes, there's plenty that's not on there yet, but there is plenty that is. And I would just encourage our listeners to go back to these primary sources and read them for themselves, find out what is actually in there for themselves. And don't just take my word for it. Don't just take Chris's word for it, but go in there and investigate it for yourselves. I know I always encourage my students to do that.
I honestly believe that what we've discussed today, for a lot of people, is history they didn't know.
Oh, yeah.
But should.
Absolutely. History you didn't know, but should. If you have any comments, questions, or you have a topic idea you would like us to consider, you can email us historyyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. Please share this podcast with your friends, your family, your colleagues. We're on Sounder FM. We're on Stitcher. We're on the one I always forget, Spotify. Google Podcasts. We're all over the place. So until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.